enough. There has to be an active connection between the names and then the actual companies themselves. And the reason I mentioned the bottom-up strategy in the U.S. that finally seems to be working, because shareholders hold a lot of power. So when there's a big pension fund, CalSTRS, California's, let me just give you an example. One pension fund had 1 million shares of ExxonMobil. That's a lot of votes. So when the board of directors slate comes up, if a company does not have enough women or is zero, and a pension fund says, we're not going to vote for that slate, that makes a big difference. So that's what that means. It's bottom up from votes. That's where the pressure comes. And then when BlackRock, which is the largest investment fund in the world, said to all the company CEOs in their portfolio, we're going to now look at your boards. If it's not diverse, we're not voting for this. So that creates pressure. And unless there is pressure, as I said over and over, it's not going to happen. So those of us who have been advocates for women on boards, we had databases, we had training, we had certification. Nothing happened. And we're not going to do quotas in the U.S. What happened was the pension funds. But there's a group that I'm part of called the 30% Coalition. We brought together all the pension funds to then have one voice and to use all the cumulative votes. If you can imagine, New York Pension Fund, California Pension Fund, Massachusetts, New Jersey, you put all that together, powerful. So tell me, there has been some progress. So what has worked in Malaysia?
Because you did mention about mentoring also, Irene. So the 30% Club, for example, actually believes in partnerships. So we have a mentoring program with PwC. So it is making sure that there is a constant active pipeline that is readily available, and then the women are taken through mentoring program with CEOs and C-suites of companies for 6 to 9 months. So there is really, at least in my experience in Malaysia, there is really no substance to say that there are not enough, there isn't a supply of board-ready women. I'll just give you an example. I sit on the board of the largest public university in Malaysia, and when we were revamping the board, it was pretty astounding. We had a candidate of 6, 4 were women, and it was the women who were absolutely stellar, and I mean stellar. And were these women are they already actually visible? No. Hardcore, hardworking, tenacious professionals who really does know the technology stack, who know the financials, know the front, middle, and back office, and who now were ready to be, board ready by training and mentoring. So there's tremendous progress in that sense, and we can't underestimate the need to make sure that all the cogs in the wheel, all the different components, the regulators, all the accounting firms, the corporates themselves, advocate groups, that whole coalition forming a very robust, vibrant ecosystem to make sure that women talent are there. And to me, this whole conversation is not a conversation about gender. This conversation is about the battle for the best talent, because there are so many urgent issues in this world: digitization, disruption, all kinds of sustainability issues, climate action. In order for us as humanity, as a planet, to be able to prevail, we need the best talent. So to me, it is about making sure that talent accessibility pipelines are diverse, and most importantly, it's inclusive, right? So if you don't have the best people on your bench, it is going to be very, very challenging to understand. How do you de-risk your business model? How do you ensure, right, there is a total risk management approach to how you do business? How do you understand what are the risks of your supply chain, in the few years, 3 to 5 years moving forward, right? So it's a holistic perspective that we need to bring, and I think that will be the key to success, to understand how everyone in the ecosystem has a role to play.
Building on that, Amy, I loved your thought there of the ecosystem. In Australia, we talk about it in the sense of it's a mosaic of individuals and institutions. There was no one silver bullet. It was really this mosaic. So let me walk you through what I think were some of the key levers. The financial press was incredibly active. If I think back to the last 10 years, I mean, the global stage has been talking about this topic of gender equity, particularly on boards. They really picked up on it. There was also in the top ASX 50 some very prominent chairs who were male. And I'm going to talk...
Well, talk about the male champions of change.
Yeah. So
okay? Because that was a structure, that is a structure that doesn't exist in any other country.
Yeah, so you mentioned Liz Broderick earlier, this former Sex Discrimination Commissioner in Australia. So the Male Champions of Change, it's actually now called the Coalition for Change, effectively partnered with some very senior, prominent, very respected gentlemen who were chairs and or senior board directors, multiple portfolios. And the partnership across government, corporate, community, as well as these champions of change that effectively rallied the discussion, both with media, both with corporations. You talked about the industry super funds. That's been a real bottoms up in Australia as well, and these male champions of change were real advocates for saying enough is enough. We have to do better. When you look at the data, there was a recent report just out of Australia. It said for every 10 percentage points of women increased on a board, they're going to get another 5% of company value. Now, when you look at the size of the capital in Australia, that makes a very significant commercial difference. This then goes away from a conversation about what are my personal views. This comes down to corporate financials and the performance of companies and their triple bottom line. So this Male Champions of Change, very powerful, strong advocates, and also in partnership with the AICD, this mentoring program. We say, oh, well, mentoring, yeah, we've done a lot of that. But this was different in the sense that the partners, the chairs, the directors who were part of that were very, very respected in the business community. So when a female graduated through the program, she had reputation, clout, she had a group, 150 ASX listed chairs and directors who knew of her and her capability. And this, I think, then goes away from, well, we can't find them, or we just need to look harder. They're there in abundance. And so the Male Champions of Change was a big lever for that.
The Human Rights Commissioner we keep talking about, Liz Broderick, who's really a groundbreaker, she created this group and basically invited a few CEOs whose boards were already fairly good, and the CEOs had to commit to be the public voice for gender diversity on boards and to use their networks to place at least one or two women on boards of other companies. And they met without staff, okay, but that's very different. And one of them talked to me and said, we actually talked about how are you doing with your women and blah, blah, and it gave them a chance to exchange notes, if you will, as to what works. So, Jimena, what do you think would work in Mexico? What do you think is needed? Because I know you have these advocacy groups. And I do know that there was an attempt to have a quota legislation. Didn't work, given the current party structure, et cetera. What do you think might work? And are women creating the pressure for it?
I think definitely women are creating pressure. I think we're becoming fierce, and there's a lot of push. But I think what you mentioned just previously on the fact of these asset managers that are putting pressure on companies to start incorporating ESG factors into their strategy, that has become really relevant. They are hearing that closely. And so more and more, I'm often invited to ESG panels and webinars and forums that are pushing this ESG. They're discussing, they're talking about it. And, you know, companies are starting to say, what is that? I don't understand it. Is it worth it? Are we doing it? But BlackRock says it's important, and they listen. So I think that's very important. So corporate boards have precisely taken these criteria at the center of business as the relevance has grown. And that's the only way they can obtain financing. So when money talks and money is guided into a certain direction, they have to do it. When you speak about diversity and inclusion, and that is part of the umbrella under the ESG criteria, there are two elements that are constantly measured, and that they are not merely a factor of social responsibility, but a business case. Companies that have 3 or more women on their boards have a 10% higher return on equity than those that do not.
That's called a business case.
That is a business
But
case.
I have to tell you, it's a two-edged sword. I don't want women, when they finally get on the board, to be responsible for financial improvement when male-driven boards don't necessarily promise success in terms of, you know, bottom line. So, yeah, I like to use that as an argument, but I also know it can work against women once they get on board.
There's another one. That companies that have 30% or more women on their boards have 16% higher return on sales and report a 26% higher return on invested capital. So, yeah.
There are 100 reports on the business case,
Yeah.
and they all show the same thing. There's less risk, greater increase in share price, better bottom line, but it's a correlation. You know, it's not one causes the other. So I just want that out there because it's used by companies a lot to say, you know, that business case is not really that strong. So, sorry.
Did you know that the private sector in Mexico is behind the public sector in terms of women representation?
Yeah. Yes.
Which is, usually it's the other way around. So,
Yeah.
So it's
Mexico.
interesting. Oh, I was just going to say, sorry. It's
I was going to ask Kun Ranbati, what do you think would be, you've made a big step, and I'm just so delighted that the conversation resulted in real change. What else do you think might be helpful to move the needle further?
Thank you, but may I reaffirm again that with your recommendation, we already announced, and then very pleased to announce at this session that we introduced the guidance on gender diversity on the board, you know, to make sure that all listed company, they fully understand and will implement our CG code. We think two ways when we talked with you last year, whether we change the CG code, that have to go to our board commissioner. It makes